Good day. Today is Thursday, 19th December 2024, and even as I make this program, President Putin of Russia is in the midst of one of his jumbo, colossal, marathon press conferences. He's been taking questions from the Russian media mostly, though an odd sprinkling of Western journalists are also in attendance, and some of them apparently have been able to ask questions. Apparently, after the press conference ends, Putin will undertake a Q&A in which millions of people across Russia have sent questions. Of course, only a selection of those will be passed on to Putin himself. But anyway, it's going to be one of those days in which Putin is going to give up an enormous amount of time to answering questions, both from the media and from ordinary Russians. And I've discussed in many places these press conferences and Q&As that Putin likes to do. They are, of course, testament to his apparently inexhaustible mental and physical energy. They do enable him to have a kind of conversation with Russians, and not just civilians, Russian civilians, but also military, people from the military as well, which I think is important for him in giving him a sense of what feeling amongst the wider Russian public is at any one particular time. What are the most important topics that people are bringing up? And that, of course, enables him to stay in touch with the shifts in Russian opinion. And, of course, it also provides him with a platform in which he can set out his views about things and give us ideas about the direction of events. Of course, these press conferences and these Q&As serve a domestic political purpose. They convey to the Russian public the fact that he is completely in control, the fact that he remains on top of his game, and the fact that he is aware of their concerns and is in a position to respond to them. So these press conferences and Q&As, which for some inexplicable reason provoke some derision in some quarters, especially in the West, or have very discrete political purposes. Now, this press conference come Q&A is still underway. The Kremlin has been providing regular updates about the information that Putin is giving. And I noticed that Putin has been talking a lot. He's been discussing a great deal the military situation in Ukraine, the state of the war. He says that the war has moved into a new situation, that the Russian army is now advancing by kilometers instead of meters. He's spoken about how the Ukrainians are now desperately short of men and how Western policy has been to fight to the last Ukrainian, and that we're now approaching the point where Ukraine might be running out of men who are willing to fight. I'm going to come to all of that shortly, but Putin has also said some interesting things about the Syrian situation. It's the first time he has actually spoken about the Syrian situation since the start of the crisis on the 27th of November. And some of the things that he said were very interesting. Firstly, he confirmed that he has not met with or spoken to President Assad, who is now, of course, in Russia, where he's been granted political asylum ever since Assad returned to Russia, came to Russia, escaped to Russia from Khmeimim airfield shortly after the fall of Damascus. Putin did say that he does intend to speak with Assad. So some kind of a meeting between the two men will no doubt take place. Obviously, Assad for the moment, probably forever, has no political role any longer, but Putin is always a courteous man, and it's likely that, if only for that reason, he is going to meet with and speak to Assad, for whom clearly he continues to feel a certain degree of respect and perhaps even affection. Who knows? But putting that aside, Putin did tell us a lot of other things. First of all, he confirmed that the Russian presence in Syria had been significantly reduced after 2019. The special forces and all of those people had left. The bases continue to operate in Syria. But as far as the Russians were concerned, following the 2020 ceasefire agreement, Syria was basically mission accomplished. And he went out of his way to say, and here, by the way, I think he was overstating it significantly, but he did say that in his opinion, Russia itself had suffered no defeat in Syria. He spoke of the fact that Russian ground troops had never been sent to fight in Syria. They were always there to support the legitimate government and the legitimate authorities. And he said that what happened after the major terrorist groups that the Russians were fighting, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, had basically been defeated. And he seemed to say, something which I don't, by the way, agree with, that to his knowledge, HTS and the other jihadi groups which have now taken power in Syria, well, he went along with the narrative that these have changed their perspectives, that they're not quite the same relentless organizations that they used to be. And anyway, Putin went out of his way to give the impression that the battle against terrorism, which the Russians had conducted in Syria, had been won and continues to be won. Well, of course, I have a different view, but this is what Putin said, and one can understand why, from a political reason, he would say it. But he did make some other very interesting points. The first is that he said that the Russians not only have been evacuating their own people from Syria, but they've also been evacuating Iranian personnel from Syria, 4,000 up to now, apparently. He also appeared to confirm that the two bases are still functioning at some level, and I gained the impression from his words that the Russians are indeed in discussion with HTS and with the new Syrian authorities about retaining those bases. He also said some very interesting things about the crisis itself as it played out. He said that at the start of the crisis, on the 27th of November, there were 30,000 Syrian troops in Aleppo and in the surrounding area. And he said that the jihadi force that infiltrated Aleppo, causing this Syrian force of 30,000 troops to implode, that this jihadi force, the initial jihadi force that entered Aleppo, numbered no more than 350 men. Now, I don't see why Putin would be telling us this if it was not so. And given that that is what appears to have happened, we get a sense here of the extent of the collapse of Syria, of the Syrian military, in the face of what took place starting on the 27th of November. Now, a number of people are starting to refer to the events in Syria over the last month, not as a war or as an insurgency or a battle between rebels and the Syrian government, but rather as some kind of internal coup. And I have to say, based on what Putin has just said, that does increasingly look to me as if that was what it was. It looks as if President Assad, over the course of the last year, perhaps longer, had gradually lost control of the Syrian government, that various senior Syrian officials were beginning to make their own decisions without reference to him. That might have involved giving tip-offs to the Israelis, for example. That might also have involved doing deals with Erdogan. Anyway, there seems to have been a collapse of internal discipline and morale within the regime itself. Now, why that happened and who was involved, these are all sorts of questions that no doubt we will all of us ask. Western special services, Britain's, the United States, France, quite plausibly, Israel, surely they must have been involved to some extent. There's an article in the Daily Telegraph which says that the jihadi fighters had not only received some training from the Americans, but they'd been told in advance that when they crossed the border into Syria, the Syrian government would collapse. So that does suggest, as I said, that there was a great deal of planning and work and infiltration of the Syrian government and subversion of that government from within. Turkey obviously also played a major and presumably the main role. But again, none of that provides us with all of the answers. We still don't know why, even as the Syrian elite seems to have decided to abandon Assad and to switch sides. We don't know why they did that, how much money was paid, what exactly was happening. All we can say, I think, is that the evidence cumulatively is pointing very much in that kind of direction. Quite plausibly, it is the case that Assad was persuaded to dismiss all the people who had been loyal to him in the earlier period of the war, people who supported the alliance with Iran, who wanted to resist the Turks and the Israelis and the others, the people who wanted Syria to maintain the course it had followed under Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad. It's likely that many of those people were pushed aside. It was quite likely also, and I think this is a factor that should not be ignored, that many members of the old guard, who were still full of energy and drive when the Syrian insurgency began in 2011, that many of these people have now grown old and retired, and that the people who replace them, many of whom will have been educated in Western schools and universities, that many of them basically had a different perspective to the people that they replaced. Anyway, Putin did make all of those points about the Syrian situation. They were remarkably cool and measured points that he made. Obviously, in saying that he doesn't believe that there's been a return to terrorism in Syria, and that he denies that the Russians have suffered a defeat in Syria. He's putting the best on a very bad situation. The chief of the general staff of the Russian military, Valery Gerasimov, who has just spoken, he's given his end-of-year address to military attaches, foreign military attaches in Moscow. He appeared to refer to the events in Syria. He did refer to the events in Syria in much starker terms. He spoke about the collapse of the Syrian Arab Republic. He talked about the collapse of the Syrian army. He appeared to attribute part of the reason for that collapse to the corrosive effect of the sanctions. But anyway, the overall point I'm making is that Gerasimov certainly doesn't seem to see the collapse in Syria in quite the, shall we say, placid terms that Putin does. But anyway, that is what Putin said. He's going to meet with Assad, and he's given us some insight both into what the Russians have been doing in Syria, evacuating not just their own personnel and Syrian officials connected to the previous government, but also Iranian assets as well, people who are Iranian assets as well, and that there are indeed discussions underway between the Russians and HTS about letting the bases stay. And lastly, on this issue, I should also say that I've seen more reports which appear to confirm that a lot of the personnel and the technical equipment and some of the weapons that had previously been located in Khmeimim are being transferred by the Russians to Libya, where the Russians seem to have a strong relationship with the man in charge of eastern Syria, Marshal Haftar, and it does look as if the Russian bases in Syria are being enlarged and strengthened. And I believe there's even some talk now of the Russians establishing some kind of naval presence in the Libyan port city of Benghazi. Now, if that happens, that will be extremely ironic, because the pro-Western insurgency that led to the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's government, of course, began in Benghazi. But perhaps we're going too far ahead of events. None of that has happened yet, and for all I know, it won't happen at all. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about Putin's words concerning Syria. Most of Putin's press conference, up to the point where I stopped listening to it and stopped reading the transcript, I suspect it will continue for most of the day, and I will give a more detailed roundup about what Putin said in my next program tomorrow. Anyway, most of Putin's comments have been in response to questions from Russian journalists, many of which, as one might expect, have centered on the domestic situation. And Putin has given overall an optimistic perspective about the state of the economy. He thinks that growth this year, GDP growth, will be around 4%. He says that there's essentially full employment in Russia, that industry is expanding, but he does admit that there is high inflation, that this has been causing serious concerns for ordinary Russians, even though he was careful to say that real incomes have increased in Russia this year by around 9%, which of course is one of the reasons why we have inflation in the first place. But I'm not going to discuss the economy, the state of the Russian economy in this program. Suffice to say that Putin's views about the economy were upbeat, though he does expect clearly that the central bank will increase interest rates again tomorrow, And it's also clear to me that Putin also expects that growth will fall next year, which is, of course, exactly what the central bank and the finance ministry want to achieve in order to bring inflation back down to the levels that the central bank that approximate more closely to the central bank's target. Anyway, as I said, there was an awful lot of discussion on Putin's part about the domestic situation, about high prices and those things. Putin also had a great deal to say about the war, but again, as one might expect, a lot of it dealt with the condition of soldiers, concerns from some soldiers that they're not receiving their back pay and their bonuses. He wanted to reassure everybody about that. There were questions about the development programs, the reconstruction programs in Donbass and Novorossiya. And again, he reassured everybody that the Russians do have an operative and fully funded plan in place about how to restore these regions, and that this plan will continue until 2030. So there was a lot of discussion about this. And by the way, and for the record, I was impressed by the way in which Putin spoke about soldiers and responded to soldiers. Apparently, one military unit has presented him with a copy of their battle flag, and he mentioned that sort of thing. One of Putin's skills is that he does know how to address different audiences within Russia. And my sense is that he knew exactly how to talk to rank and file Russian soldiers, and he did this well. But what I want to focus today is on this vexed issue of negotiations and the dealings with Donald Trump. And he again said that though he hasn't had any direct contact with Trump since Trump ceased to be president 4 years ago, he's fully open to a future meeting with Trump, though for the moment no such meeting is planned, and he has no idea when and whether it will take place. So that was interesting. I'm not putting too much weight on this, but that was, to say again, what Putin himself said. And he also touched on the question of negotiations. And this, I know, is the topic that many people are going to be most interested in, and especially in the light about negotiations that is floating around. Now, before I go to what Putin said in response to the specific question about negotiations, I do want to make the point that Putin did talk about the conduct of the war, and in nothing that he said was he giving, as far as I could see, the slightest hint that he's going to make any fundamental compromises on positions that he has taken up to now, or that he expects the war to end any time soon. He spoke about the continued strengthening of the army, the fact that it is increased in size. He spoke about how he believes that Russia today, because of its enormous upgrade in its military capabilities, its military technological capabilities, but also because of the vast experience that the army has acquired in the war, that he believes that he has the best and most powerful army in the world, or that Russia has. I mean, again, I'm taking these comments from third parties, but I understand that that was what Putin said. He spoke again about the Oreshnik, and he again essentially bragged about it. He spoke about how this is a completely new weapon. He made it clear that it is indeed a ballistic missile, not a glide vehicle. He didn't say that exactly, but he made contrasts between the Oreshnik and the avant-garde glide vehicle that has been installed on certain Russian ballistic missiles. And he spoke about the fact that the avant-garde never leaves the Earth's atmosphere, whereas by contrast the Oreshnik follows a ballistic trajectory. So it does look as if, anyway, this confirms that the Oreshnik is not a hypersonic glide vehicle. It is a different technology altogether. He didn't really address in this press conference its destructive power or comment to any extent about the discussions on the degree of damage that was done to the Yuzhmash factory against which the Oreshnik was tested. But he did again go to great lengths to say that the Oreshnik cannot be intercepted by any existing air defense system, certainly not one possessed by the West. And he even proposed that Russia and the Western powers conduct an experiment, that the Russians choose a location in Kiev which they will attack with the Oreshnik system, that they inform the Western powers in advance of where this attack will be, that the West then sends all its best anti-missile and anti-aircraft systems to this location. The THAADs, the Patriots, the Iris-Ts, all of those. And then the Russians test the Oreshnik against these air defenses. And Putin said, well, then we will see whether it really can be shot down or intercepted in the way the West says, or whether it will get through as we believe. It was typical Putin again, because of course he knows that the West will never agree to such a challenge, even though he said that this experiment would be interesting and it would be valuable to both sides. The more interesting thing that he said about the Oreshnik, incidentally, was that he appeared to link it to the installation by the United States of its anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Romania and Poland. He talked about that at length. He didn't say that the Oreshnik is specifically designed to counter those systems in Poland and Romania, or the new hypersonic missiles that the United States is proposing to install in Germany. But if you followed his words carefully, he very clearly implied it. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Glenn Deason and myself interviewed Professor Theodore Postol, who discussed with us the dangers of the US installation of hypersonic missiles in Germany. And Professor Postol, to a great deal of controversy and pushback from many people, said that the Russians do not yet have the technology to be able to detect launches of medium-range missiles and hypersonic missiles from Germany, and that installing these missiles in Germany in the way that is being suggested, therefore significantly reduces the reaction time and is extremely dangerous and destabilizing. And Professor Postol went into a long discussion about how the United States does possess the capability to detect the launches of such systems, that specialized infrared cameras were created by the United States after a vast technological and scientific, on the back of a vast technological and scientific program, and that this has given the United States a detection capability which the Russians for the moment don't have. And as I said, those words of Professor Postol, I remember, were controversial. Well, I noticed that 3 days ago, the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, whilst addressing the Defense Ministry Board in Putin's presence, spoke about certain tasks that the Russian military and military-industrial complex had been given by Putin to fulfill. And amongst those, Belousov mentioned this: Russia must ensure it is able to promptly detect the launches of US medium-range missiles and intercept them. All issues concerning the serial production and deployment of Russian systems of this type, hypersonic weaponry included, must be addressed. And the Russian Defense Ministry, in recording these words of Belousov, has highlighted the words that Russia must ensure it is able to promptly detect the launches of US medium-range missiles and intercept them. So I'm going to suggest that those words, whilst they don't absolutely confirm and corroborate what Professor Postol said, they do suggest that Professor Postol's analysis is correct. The Russians, for the moment, do not have the capability to detect launches of medium-range missiles. Why would Putin be tasking the Russian military and the Russian military-industrial complex to acquire that capability if Russia already possesses it? Just saying. But the Russians do now have a program to acquire that capability and also to develop their own missile arsenal and to use it to counter American missiles, hypersonic and otherwise, based in Europe. So there we are. I would say that clearly is one of the purposes of the Oreshnik. It's clearly intended. It was clearly originally developed as a strike instrument against these American bases in Europe. And moving forward, just going a little bit further, I strongly suspect that when the Russians have spoken about countering American missile strikes on their territory, including those nominally carried out by Ukraine, about which I will say more shortly, I strongly suspect that the Russians have had those American missile bases, the ones in Romania and Poland, and the ones currently under construction in Germany in mind, that it is those bases that are the considered target. And as I said, it was to attack these bases, it was for the purpose of attacking these bases that the Oreshnik was designed and is now being put into production and eventual service. So there we are. Putin, I didn't see him giving an inch on compromise with the West or with the Ukrainians on the situation in Ukraine. I got the strong impression, on the contrary, that he is sticking to his fundamental positions. And he has actually said so, or he has essentially said so, over the course of this press conference. Now, he was asked about negotiations with Ukraine, and he said this. And again, this is a translation that I'm taking from a third party. It is not an official translation provided by the Kremlin. We reached an agreement in Istanbul at the end of 2022. Actually, it wasn't at the end of 2022. It was in April 2022, but never mind. I repeat for the 100th time, the Ukrainian side initialed this agreement, which means that, on the whole, it agreed with it. Then, for some reason, they refused. It is clear why. Because Mr. Johnson came here, a man with a good haircut, and said they should fight to the last Ukrainian. So they are fighting. Soon they will run out of Ukrainians who want to fight. I don't think there will be any Ukrainians left who want to fight. We are ready, but the other side needs to be ready for negotiations and compromise. Now, that to me strongly suggests that as far as Putin is concerned, for the moment at least, the starting point of the negotiations, just as he said when he addressed the Russian Foreign Ministry Board in June, that the starting point for the negotiations continues to be Istanbul Plus. In other words, the four regions the four regions evacuated by Ukraine, handed over to Russia, Ukraine giving up any idea of joining NATO at any time, and once again accepting neutral status. And once all of that has happened, at that point there can be a ceasefire and all the various other things that need to be discussed: the status of Russian speakers, the status of the Russian language, the restoration of the Russian Orthodox Church, the mechanisms to cleanse Ukraine of the ideology that Putin has been talking about, the ideology from the 1930s and 40s, the limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. Those discussions can then again resume, though once more the starting point must be what was initialed and apparently agreed in Istanbul in April 2022. It is unrealistic for the Ukrainians, who are in a far worse military position today than they were in April 2022, to think that they can get better terms now than the terms they were offered and appeared to agree to then. And I have to say that there is no indication so far, none that I have seen, that Putin, for the moment, is entertaining any thought of shifting his position. Maybe once some kind of dialogue with the Americans gets underway, maybe when General Kellogg comes to Moscow, and about that I will have more to say shortly, when all of this happens, then possibly, just possibly, the Russians might start to look for compromises, the sort of compromises that they could make. Though I don't know what those compromises would be, incidentally, and I suspect that at any point in the negotiations on Ukraine, the Russians are likely to take an extremely hard line. But that, for the moment at least, remains Putin's position as far as I can see. It is Istanbul Plus. He's not going to renegotiate that which he was led to think had already been agreed in Istanbul. And I don't think that position is going to shift anytime soon. And every other Russian official who has spoken on this issue has also said up to now that the Russian position is not going to shift. So, coming back to what I was saying in my program yesterday, ideas of freezes and ceasefires, of so-called peacekeeping forces being sent to Ukraine. Apparently there's an argument, there are furious arguments about this. Some countries in the EU, Finland, for example, as I discussed in yesterday's program, Poland, seem to be dead against the idea. Others, like Italy, are saying that, yes, they would be prepared to participate, but only if what was under discussion was some kind of peacekeeping force, one obviously on a far more limited military scale than the one that has been discussed. The French and the British, predictably, taking a much harder line. They want a huge force sent to Ukraine. A few weeks ago, the Russian intelligence chief, Sergei Narishkin, spoke about plans to send 100,000 troops from Western countries to Ukraine. At one point, Macron was talking about 40,000. Stubb, the Finnish president, was talking about 150,000. Surprise, surprise, Reuters is now saying that the actual number is 100,000, which was, of course, exactly the number that Narishkin gave, which, by the way, shows that the Russians have been monitoring this discussion and have been aware of it for some time and are getting accurate information about it. Anyway, the British and the French are talking about sending an expeditionary force to Ukraine, one large enough and powerful enough to deter and fight the Russians, with obviously the kind of ironclad guarantee that the Americans will come to their rescue that was discussed in that article by Anatol Lieven that I spoke about yesterday. So anyway, all of these plans, they've created frictions. Some countries, Finland and Poland, are dead against the idea of sending European troops to Ukraine. The Italians might be willing to contribute a small peacekeeping force. The British and the French want to send a proper army to fight Ukraine. A genuine repeat of the Korean armistice proposal, whereby there was an armistice, but with a strong American military contingent in South Korea, where it remains to this day. So just saying, so these discussions continue to take place, but as far as I can see, Putin is rejecting all of these proposals. He's not interested in them. I don't think any of these proposals are going to fly. And in the meantime, there continue to be voices within the West who appear to be opposed to any negotiation at all. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the one who is most outspoken about this is the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, who continues to speak about continuing the war until Russia is defeated in some way. So, there we go. Now, even as these discussions about negotiations float around, those parties who clearly do not want any kind of negotiations or any sort of peace settlement remain active. One of them, of course, is President Zelensky. He seems very averse to negotiations. He's speaking about why it is much more important to strengthen Ukraine than to enter into any sort of discussions with the Russians. He continues to talk about Ukraine getting cast iron security guarantees from the West before it can enter into negotiations with the Russians. And he's made it very clear that what he means by security guarantees is something analogous to NATO membership, and preferably to NATO membership itself. Now, yesterday, the Biden administration, which does appear to have debated within itself the idea of inviting Ukraine to join NATO. Anyway, it issued a statement in which it said that the Biden administration would not do that, that this was something that they were going to leave to Donald Trump to do. It was a matter better settled by the future administration than by the current one. Now, that is interesting coming from the Biden administration. It's the first seemingly moderate step that they've made since the November election. Every other action that they have taken has apparently pointed towards further escalation. And of course, one does wonder why they would make a statement like this. Maybe they've taken soundings and they have found that several NATO countries remain adamantly opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership, and that if the United States took a step of appearing to invite Ukraine to join NATO in that kind of way, it might create a public split within NATO. It's one possibility. Another possibility is that the Pentagon, which is clearly, in my opinion, at least some people within it, are clearly looking for ways to wind down the whole Ukraine commitment. The Pentagon has put its foot down and has said that it does not want Ukraine in NATO or any military commitments by the United States at this time to defend Ukraine, or by extension to defend European troops who are deployed to Ukraine. That's that could be one further interpretation. I'm afraid there is a third one, and a Machiavellian one, which is that the Biden administration is planning or intending to do something that they calculate will make it more difficult for Trump to refuse an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO, and that this something, whatever it is, will be done over the next couple of weeks whilst Biden himself remains president, and that Trump will be maneuvered, therefore, into persisting with this offer to Ukraine to join NATO, which will, of course, destroy the prospect of any kind of dialogue being established between the Russians and the Americans, provoking a huge crisis in international relations, which I have to say I strongly suspect many people within the Biden administration continue to want. So that's, I'm afraid, a third possibility. And we are getting some indications that something like that might be in the works. The first is that there is now a huge row underway between Zelensky and Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister. Zelensky is speaking about Orban in extremely rude terms. He's made it absolutely clear, he says, that he will not accept Hungary as any kind of mediator or honest broker in the crisis. He's all but accusing Orban of being on Russia's side in the war. Having been to Hungary recently and spoken to Hungarian officials, I can say absolutely categorically that Hungary is not on Russia's side. The Hungarians want to keep the Russians as far from their borders as they possibly can. They made that point many times in my presence. They think the way to do that is to negotiate a peace, and they want obviously to preserve Ukraine, and they want to do all of these things because they think it is in the national interests of Hungary. But of course that doesn't prevent Zelensky and his friends in the European Union, in NATO, in the United States, in Britain, from repeating this allegation that Orban is in some way working for the Russians in this matter. So there is that sort of action that Zelensky is undertaking. But there's also been more kinetic action, if I can speak of it in that way. The day before yesterday, as I discussed in my program yesterday at very considerable length, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, the head of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical defense forces, was assassinated outside his home in Moscow. An extraordinarily provocative act. Jeff Roberts, the historian, has very kindly forwarded to me an article on responsible statecraft by Peter Rutland, who I understand is a former US diplomat. Peter Rutland makes the point that assassinations of this kind, of which Ukraine has carried out many over the course of this war, though not of such a high-profile figure, that none of these assassinations has worked to Ukraine's advantage. They've only hardened the Russian position. Peter Rutland, has also made a point which, as far as I can see, no other Western commentator has done up to now, which is that these kind of murders actually are straightforward violations of international law. He quotes a law professor at Notre Dame University, Mary Ellen O'Connor, as saying that assassination is always unlawful. He points out that the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights have both confirmed that there is a prohibition against conducting assassinations of this kind that goes all the way back to the 1907 Hague Convention, which barred treacherously or perfidiously killing people who are not aware that they are in imminent danger. And he also points out that there is a Geneva Convention from 1949 which declared that it is prohibited to kill, injure or capture an adversary by resort to perfidy, such as the feigning of civilian non-combatant status. So undoubtedly the assassination of Kirillov does violate international law. I don't think there's any serious doubt about this. Peter Rutland does point out that all the major powers have transgressed against this multiple times. Israel makes no secret of the fact. The United States has assassinated all sorts of people at various times that it claims are involved in Islamist terrorism. And of course the Russians themselves have done this too, with Putin in effect admitting recently that the man that was exchanged for the American journalist Ivan Gershkovich, Vadim Krasikov, who was held in Germany, was a Russian assassin sent to kill, which he did successfully, a Chechen leader in Berlin in 2019. But having said that, let's say it again. The fact that everybody does it doesn't mean that it is not a violation of international law. It obviously is. So, the murdering Kirillov was a flagrant violation of international law and was an extraordinarily provocative act, having been carried out in Moscow. So this is an act which, by the way, to make this entirely clear, I don't believe that actions of this kind are carried out by Ukrainian intelligence agencies on their own initiative. I have no doubt that they are approved by the political leadership in Kiev. Anyway, this was an assassination which was carried out in Kiev, in Moscow, and it was clearly done, again, in my opinion, in order to make the situation more difficult, to provoke tensions, to provoke the Russians into some kind of reaction of the sort that might lead to a breakdown in any sort of negotiation process between the Russians and the Americans. And, well, Putin has, by the way, responded to the events, the assassination of Kirillov. I understand that he has referred to it as a terrorist act. It's a part of the press conference that I haven't actually had time to catch up with. But more importantly, there's been other steps that the Ukrainians have taken to escalate the situation still more. Now, yesterday, over the course of yesterday, we got more reports of missile strikes on Russian positions. Now, there is some uncertainty about this because if one believes the reports, 2 separate missile strikes, perhaps in both cases involving the use of Storm Shadow British missiles, took place. One was on the towns of Berdyansk and Tokmak in Zaporozhye region. This is, of course, an area that's part of the 4 territories. It's post-2014 Russia. But the other target appears to have been certain locations around the city of Rostov, which is pre-2014 Russia, and which Putin has previously made a red line. He said that missile strikes on targets inside pre-2014 Russia would be a red line because, as no one disputes, such missile strikes can only take place if they are facilitated or prepared with the direct involvement of American military technicians. So, about the strikes on Berdyansk and Tokmak, about that there is no doubt. The Russians have confirmed them. They say that 4 Storm Shadows were launched against targets close to Berdyansk and Tokmak, and the reports say that all of the missiles were shot down and did no damage. Now, about the attack on Rostov, so far as I can see, the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed that this was a similar attack involving missiles. There was a big drone attack by Ukraine on targets inside Russia last night, and it's just possible, I suppose, that the attack on locations in Rostov was carried out using drones. But if it was conducted using missiles, which the reports say the reports from the area say was the case, then of course it again breaches a Russian red line. So we'll just have to wait and see what the Russians say. But what I will say is this: even assuming, and we would probably be right to assume, that this was an attack using missiles, probably Storm Shadows, perhaps ATACMS missiles, on targets near Rostov. All of the reports suggest that the attack again was a failure. Not just Russian reports, but Ukrainian reports as well. It seems that up to 10 missiles might have been involved. All of them perhaps were shot down. There are reports that an oil refinery in the area was damaged, resulting in a fire. Though I have to say, the pictures that have been released, the film that's been released of a fire in the region, does not show the picture I've seen, the film I've seen of a fire in the region does not show a fire in an oil refinery. I can myself, I believe, confidently distinguish the difference. It shows a fire on the landscape. It could be fire that was caused by falling debris or falling fuel from an oil tank, from a tank of the missile itself. It certainly wasn't the kind of fire you would associate with an attack on the oil refinery. I'm not saying that such a fire did not take place, just that the film that was shown of such a fire last night, in my opinion, definitely doesn't show that. There might be other film, there might have been a hit on the refinery, but whatever it was, it doesn't look as if any major military facility was damaged, and it doesn't seem as if there were any casualties either. So if this was a missile attack, then it would appear to have failed, just as the missile strikes on Berdyansk and Tokmak in Zaporozhye failed. A point that continues to be overlooked is that while all of these missile strikes on pre-2014 Russia, which the Biden administration authorized back in November, do cross a Russian red line, do cross an actual Russian red line, they've also exposed, yet again, the complete ineffectiveness of the missiles that are being used. The Russians are able to shoot nearly all of them down. The amount of damage that these strikes do is not only limited, it amounts to no more than pinpricks, and not even very severe pinpricks at that. The effectiveness of these missiles has been shown to be extremely low, and expensive missiles, which are in limited supply, are being used to no useful purpose. Now, this is, however, where we come back to the question of Russian red lines. Because one of the most interesting things over the last couple of days is that even as Zelensky and his backers and the Ukrainians continue to do whatever they can to provoke the Russians in whatever the way they can, the Trump people are doing what they can in order to put the fire out, in order to keep the diplomatic process still on track. So way back on the 25th of November, in an interview with Time magazine, Donald Trump said that he vehemently disagreed with the decision to conduct missile strikes against Russia. He repeated the same point a couple of days ago, and he also floated the possibility, in fact the expectation, that as soon as he becomes president on the 20th of January, he's going to reverse this decision. Yesterday, Trump's peace envoy, General Kellogg, gave an interview on US television. And the interview was interesting in the sense that, once again, Kellogg spoke in ways that many would say were largely sympathetic to Ukraine or seemed to accept many of Ukraine's perspectives. He again claimed, by the way, that the Ukrainians, along with the Russians, were ready for ceasefire talks, or at least for talks. The Russians, as Putin has again said, are indeed ready for talks. The Ukrainians have consistently said that they are not. So Kellogg, like his boss, Donald Trump, appears to be misrepresenting the Ukrainian position, unless, of course, the Ukrainians are saying something completely different to Trump in private than what they're saying in public, which could be true, but then that inevitably would beg further questions about whether, if they did turn up to negotiations, they would be negotiating in good faith rather than under duress. Just saying. But anyway, over the course of this interview, Kellogg then went on to say that the assassination of Kirillov was clearly a mistake and that it didn't help. It didn't help Ukraine, and it didn't help at all, though he did think, which was his way of saying that he hoped, that it would not get in the way of setting up negotiations. And shortly after, I think, Kellogg said that, an article appeared in the New York Times, which also discussed at length Ukraine's assassination program in Russia and in the four regions. I discussed that at length in my program yesterday. And it was said over the course of this interview, this article said again that Ukraine has gained nothing from these assassinations. They've not changed the direction of the war. They've been a diversion of resources, including intelligence resources. They've hardened feelings on the Russian side. They are, as Kellogg put it, a mistake. I wonder who inspired that article in the New York Times, and whether the editors of the New York Times anticipated that it would so closely correspond with what Kellogg said. Anyway, my point is that the Trump administration is now coming out publicly and is saying that things are being done by the Biden administration and the Ukrainians, which it doesn't agree with and which it thinks are wrong. One is missile strikes against Russia. They think that that is wrong, and Trump has all but said that he intends to reverse it. And assassinations against senior officials in Russia. And Kellogg, and I'm sure he was asked by Trump to say this. Anyway, he's now said that he too thinks that was a mistake and it was wrong. Now, I think what the Trump people are trying to do is to try to restrain this process of escalation that is currently underway. In other words, whenever escalation happens, whenever missile strikes take place, whenever a Russian general is killed, whenever some extraordinary move by the Ukrainians is taken, the Trump people come out and say, look, this has nothing to do with us. We don't agree. We don't think this is the right thing at all. We're going to try and reverse it as soon as we come into office. We think this is all a mistake. And one of the audiences, in fact, the key audience to whom these comments are addressed must presumably be the Russians. And I think what the Trump people are trying to do is reinforce the private message, which I am sure has been conveyed to the Russians by Orban, because as far as I know, nobody else is communicating to the Russians on Trump's behalf, which is, please, go on exercising restraint for the next couple of weeks. We understand how incredibly dangerous this whole situation is. We know how crazy the people in Kiev and some of the people in Washington are, but we do generally, seriously mean getting into some kind of dialogue with you. We do generally, truly want to end the war. We don't yet fully understand maybe all the problems and all of the issues that might arise. But if you do want to speak to us, then please exercise restraint for the next 4 weeks, so that these negotiations can actually happen. These discussions between you and us can actually happen. And I noticed that Kellogg, in some of the recent comments that he has made, has finally confirmed that he is indeed intending at some point to go to Moscow. He's obviously going to go to Kiev. He said as much, but he's clearly open to going to Moscow. And in truth, he can't function as a peace envoy unless he does so. So anyway, that's what's going on. Now, for the moment, the Russians are playing along with what they're being asked to do by Orban and Trump. And it is Trump who is the key person here. And of course, as I said in this latest press conference, Putin says that he's prepared to meet with Trump if that is what Trump wants. But that, I think, still depends a lot on how events play out over the next couple of weeks. Because it could be that even as these missile strikes, which perhaps the Biden people expected and the Ukrainians expected, would provoke a massive Russian reaction, even as basically scuppering any prospect of talks, even as those missile strikes have proved ineffectual and have failed to do that up to now, even as the assassination of Kirillov is unlikely to do that either, it could be that something much bigger is being prepared. Now, there's been rumours over the last couple of hours, or rather a couple of days, that the Ukrainians are planning some further incursion into Russia, with many suggesting that there's a concentration of Ukrainian troops in Chernihiv and that they're preparing to advance into Bryansk region. I touched on all of that in my program yesterday. I said that on balance, this seemed to me unlikely. I don't think myself that the Ukrainians are planning an attack on Bryansk region. What realistically could it achieve? Even if the Ukrainians captured some territory, as they did in Kursk in August, how does that change the outcome of the war? At this point, if the Ukrainians are indeed going to reverse the narrative, then they need to do something big and dramatic, something that really could act as a major shock and transform the entire perspective of the war. And the only way that they can do that, given that the Kursk operation has been a total debacle, is by launching an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, making another of the unending attempts that they have been making to try to capture the nuclear power plant and to wrong foot the Russians in that way. And there are reports that there are Ukrainian troops concentrated on the northern end of the former Kakhovka reservoir. The Russians have released film of some of these troops. There's been apparently multiple drone attacks on Ukrainian positions north of the Kakhovka reservoir. I'm not saying that this is what is going to happen, but I would not be surprised if it did. I suspect that this is the last big gamble that Zelensky has left, and indeed Biden and his people have left, the last big throw of the dice. If it fails, then of course Ukraine's position will be left even worse. Whether they would be able to press forward with negotiations, whether Trump's people would be able to keep a negotiation track afloat, in that case is very difficult to say. And of course, if it succeeds, well, I'm not going to anticipate and try and guess what that would mean, but certainly it would be a major success, even if perhaps only an ephemeral one, for Zelensky and his people. So my own guess is that we could very well be looking at a possible attack on the nuclear power station at some point over the next couple of weeks. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'll be very surprised indeed if no thought has been given to that possibility. So, the Americans Trump and his people wanting dialogue with the Russians, floating all sorts of ideas, the Europeans floating all kinds of ideas about assembling peacekeeping forces, or to be more correct, war-fighting forces to Ukraine, which the Russians will certainly reject. My own sense is that, especially after Putin's comments today, I suspect that the Trump people will gradually, over the next few weeks, start to form a more realistic understanding of what the possibilities for a negotiation actually are, and that they might start to scale down their expectations. In the meantime, the war goes on. And to repeat a point I've made many times, it is the events in the war that continue to be the main driver. We've had more reports of major Russian advances. And these advances are now taking place right across the battlefronts. And the pace is accelerating still further. Putin said as much during the press conference. He said that the Russians are now taking kilometers instead of meters, and that Ukraine will soon run out of men willing to fight. And if you follow events in the battle closely, you can see this. If we're talking about Kursk region, we've probably seen a further significant contraction of the Kursk pocket. Again, it's not always easy to get the complete details, but the Russians, group of forces north, are now saying that the Russians are in full control of the village of Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. So they are getting again very close to Suja itself. Putin, over the course of his press conference, made some astonishing claims about the Kursk battles. He said that the Ukrainians have lost more armoured vehicles in Kursk than they did throughout the whole of 2023. Many more than Ukraine lost over the course of its summer 2023 counteroffensive. So this operation in Kursk looks like the graveyard of Ukraine's armored forces. And one Russian reporter who's been there spoke in rather, over the course of this press conference, spoke in rather horrified terms of how the countryside in that area is littered with Ukrainian dead. Of course, all of these Russian advances in Kursk region continue to be attributed to the presence of the North Koreans. There have been claims that several hundred North Korean soldiers have been killed over the course of this fighting. Evidence to support those claims up to now have not been provided. I'm not going to spend any more time discussing them. The Russians have recently enlarged their bridgehead west of the Oskol River. Again, it's not entirely clear exactly what is taking place, but this bridgehead appears to be located somewhere to the north of Kupiansk itself, and it seems like that a village called Dvorichne is about to fall fully under Russian control, putting the Ukrainian position in Kupiansk itself in increasing danger. There's been a report from Russian troops in Chasiv Yar. They appear to contradict claims that the Ukrainians recaptured the refractory plant there in Chasiv Yar. The troops are saying that, on the contrary, more territory around the industrial zone has been captured, and they're speaking about the Ukrainians beginning to withdraw at least some troops from Chasiv Yar. And there have been more reports of further Russian advances, significant Russian advances in the Toretsk area. The biggest events are happening near Pokrovsk, the most important part of the battle. Security services, whoever they are, have told TASS that these are Russian security services. We see attempts to withdraw from positions in Kotlino. This is a village somewhere to the south of Pokrovsk. Currently, this is not on a large scale, but the enemy's defenses in this section of the front line have gaps. So the Russians are saying that the situation there is getting bad. Our old friend, for the Ukrainians, our old friend Vladimir Rogov says that Ukrainian units in Kurakovo were ordered to remain in position before Trump's inauguration by all means, so that the Ukrainian armed forces are present there up until this event. Additional units are being deployed to Kurakovo, with one of the identified groups being the Skala Volunteer Assault Battalion. Several hundred Ukrainian troops remain on the territory of the thermal power plant in Kurakovo. Some units retreated to the cemetery and are trying to establish a foothold there. It is not the first time that we witness attempts to hold positions in cemeteries, like in Rabotino, and it never helps the Ukrainians in any way. So a small isolated garrison of a couple of hundred men holding out in a cemetery and a thermal power plant to the west of Kurachovo itself, and told to cling on for another 4 or 5 weeks until Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. If true, and of course this is what Vladimir Rogov is saying, it looks like another pointless sacrifice of brave men. And Vladimir Rogov also tells us that our troops are advancing in the Vremivka salient area, northwest of Storozhevoye towards Neskuchnoye. This is an attempt to bypass Storozhenvoye from the west and advance north of it. And Rogov has also said that the village of Makarovka, immediately to the south, has been captured. And of course, we're talking here about territory to the south and west, immediately to the south and west of Velikaya Novosilka, which also looks like it's being surrounded. And Vladimir Rogov has also told us that our troops have completely secured Novi Komar after a number of counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces advancing to the Mokry Yali River and the settlement of Novo Ocheretovatoye, which I don't know where that is, by the way. But anyway, the Russians now in firm control of Novi Komar. So, a tight ring being established around Velikaya Novosilka. If you look at where this village of Neskuchnoye is located, if the Ukrainians retreat to it, then in effect Velikaya Novosilka and those troops in Neskuchnoye, Ukrainian troops in Neskuchnoye, are surrounded, and it looks as if Kurachovo, we're seeing an encirclement there take place as well. So Putin says that the Ukrainians are running out of men left to fight, and that the Russians are advancing by kilometers rather than by meters. And I think he's absolutely right. I think that we're going to get one big battle, probably over the next few weeks, which is the battle for Pokrovsk. When Pokrovsk falls, and it's a question of when rather than if, unless there's some political process that intervenes, which I don't expect, then I think that it will be impossible any longer to deny that the war is lost, and the Russians, especially if Velikaya Novosilka is captured as well, have an unimpeded route to advance all the way west to the Dnieper and could arrive there in central Ukraine. And then we will have a crisis, a military crisis, of a level that we have never seen at any point in the war up to now. So all of this maneuvering is taking place. The Americans, the Russians, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians ahead of negotiations. But as far as I can see, Putin, for the moment, remains firm. The Trump people are trying to put out the fires that the Biden team are lighting, but Zelensky and his backers continue to do whatever they can to set the situation alight. It's going to be a very, very rocky 4 weeks. Well, that's the end of my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.